Candleman, Book 1, The Society of Unrelenting Vigilance, written by Glenn Dakin. Chapter 1, The Present. So, this is my birthday treat, Theo said, gazing about him. The teenager surveyed the world gloomily, the fine drizzle already causing his dark hair to droop over his unhappy grey eyes. And you said I would be visiting a special place, surrounded by important people. Just my little joke, young master, interrupted Mr. Nicely, Theo's butler, with a bright smile. The pair stood in a cemetery. Lopsided gravestones, monuments, and sad stone angels surrounded them. There are a lot of important people in graveyards, the butler added. Theo just looked miserable. His face was almost as pale as the marble cherubs in front of him. I had hoped, now that I'm older, he began. Now, Mr. Nicely wagged a finger. You know you aren't safe amongst living people, he added, leading the way down a tangled path. Or at least they aren't safe amongst you, on account of your condition. But I've got my gloves on, Theo protested, glancing down at the thick leather gauntlets he was ordered to wear at all times. He knew his words would be wasted. He was only too aware of the rules that governed his illness. Half an hour, Mr. Nicely shouted, and twirled his umbrella jauntily. Theo ignored the rain and peered around, his heart racing. He had been out of the house for a year. He hadn't seen another person, outside of his household, for 365 days. Theo's predictable routine meant that he always saw the same 3 people. Mr. Nicely the butler, Clarice the maid, and Dr. Emmanuel Saint, his guardian. No one else was allowed to enter his circle of misery, just in case. It would be a thrill simply to glimpse another human being. We might see one from a distance, Theo ventured. Might is not for you, young master, chuckled Mr. Nicely. Your life has been planned and regulated to leave might and maybe out of the equation. Now take a quick stroll and enjoy the company of your betters. Here the butler nodded down at the leaf-strewn graves. And we'll get back home. Theo strode quickly through the woods. Already his legs were aching from the unaccustomed exercise. But it was a nice ache, not the horrible pain that followed his treatment. He peered through the clumps of thistles and old men's beard that choked the pathways. Years ago, his guardian had said a cemetery keeper lived here. There had been some mention of his having a daughter. Maybe Theo would see them. I've half a mind to nip home early, the butler called out from somewhere behind him. Clearly, Mr. Nicely had seen enough of this dreary November day already. Then I can just squeeze in a nice cup of cocoa before the good doctor returns home from his meeting. Home early? For my one trip out in 365 days? Theo made an effort to distance himself from the internal presence of the butler. He ducked under the dark boughs of knotty old hawthorn and found himself in a little clearing. Suddenly he saw it. Under the glistening leaves of a thick holly tree, a tiny parcel was perched on top of a gravestone. It was wrapped in black paper, with a golden bow tied around it. Tiny beads of rain shone on the bow. He looked closer. Written in silver ink on the black paper was one word. Theo. It was for him, only for him. Somehow he knew not to mention it to his companion. Too surprised to really know what he was doing, he slipped the little packet into his coat pocket. Then he turned round to see Mr. Nicely stroll into view. Come on, then, the butler grinned. Early home, and a drop of cocoa for yours truly will be just the ticket. You've been far too unruly already. To the butler's surprise, Theo made no protest. Time to open your gifts, Dr. Saint announced with a smile. He had white teeth, round glasses, and bald head all gleamed down on Theo as he sat in the study. Theo was back at Empire Hall, the vast mansion in Kensington Gore, one of London's wealthiest quarters, where he and his guardian lived. This was one of Theo's 3 rooms, the bathroom, his bedroom, and the study. He barely knew any other places in the world. In front of him on a shiny walnut desk were 3 parcels, one from Dr. Saint, one from Mr. Nicely, and one from Clarice. They all waited expectantly. Theo opened the gifts. The first was The Complete Guide to Good Manners, Part 4, a large volume from Dr. Saint. There was a framed photograph from Mr. Nicely, of himself. And finally, Clarice had bought Theo a book of fairy tales, 10 years too young for him. Completely checked and approved by myself, Dr. Saint added, as Theo flicked through the book's garish illustrations. He tried to say thank you, but his mouth only framed the words. No sound would come out. "Oh, a bun for harvest," chortled Mr. Nicely. Theo looked up. "But what about—" "Yes?" demanded Dr. Saint. "I asked for a book about the world, or about history, something about real life," he faltered. Dr. Saint exchanged a glance with Mr. Nicely. "I'm sorry, Theo," said Dr. Saint, eyeing his ward with a strange, cold gaze, "but we've been through this all 100 times. The world is not good for you, and you are not good for it." "So you keep saying," Theo blurted out, "but I'm nearly a man now, and I haven't got a clue about what it's really like. Out there." He gestured toward the curtained window. The doctor sighed and placed his hands together in the prayer-like gesture he often adopted when being wise. "Now listen, Theo. Facts about the world, real events, true history. All these things excite the mind. That stimulation is, sadly, very bad for you. It makes your mind race, your metabolism accelerate. The effect on your condition could be disastrous." Theo looked away bleakly. "I am trying to save you from your own curiosity, Theo," the doctor said. "I know that where a teenager is involved, I've set myself a thankless task." "You're a bloomin' hero, sir," Mr. Nicely muttered, looking at the floor. "But most of the time I feel all right," Theo cried out, "apart from being bored out of my mind." Dr. Saint sighed. Mr. Nicely tutted. "I fear Theo's thrilling day out has muddled his wits," Dr. Saint said. "Warm up the tube, Mr. Nicely. I suggest an extra long session of therapy." Theo went pale. That night, as on every other, he was forced to stand upright in the mercy tube, a transparent casing with a powerful ray emitter housed at the top. His eyes screwed tight against the blinding light. Theo was bathed in radiation for several minutes. He could hardly stand afterwards, and felt sick in the pit of his stomach. Clarice brought him a glass of water and his dressing gown. As he sat on the edge of his bed, he heard the others talking in the room next door. "Well, I'm out with the Society of Good Works tonight," said Dr. Saint. "We have to give those windows to take care of, and a big cheque to give the Prime Minister." "Very saintly of you, Dr. Saint," said Mr. Nicely. "Nice of you to say so, Mr. Nicely," said Dr. Saint. Theo grimaced, crawled up onto his bed half-dazed, and passed out. It was evening. The thrum of traffic in the street was dying away. Unseen dogs exchanged barks farther down the gore. Clarice came in to clear up the supper things. Theo leaned back against his pillow and studied the halos of the lamplight on the ceiling. He was pleased to be left alone with Clarice. With her plain face, short, mousy hair, and drab uniform, she couldn't be described as attractive, but she was a quiet, soothing presence. At least she didn't smile all the time. "I've been thinking," Theo said, "if my condition is so bad, why don't I see anything wrong in my skin?" He peeled off his gloves as he always did before sleeping, and studied his hands in the half-life. "And if the mercy tube is curing me, why do I only feel terrible after I come after it?" he continued, pleased to be able to ask questions freely. The maid picked up the tray and left the room without a word. It was all Theo had expected. After all, she was completely deaf. At last Theo was alone. He stepped across the room, took the parcel from his coat pocket, and returned to his bed to study it. There was his name on the paper in ornate silvery writing. Theo. He liked that. There was something about seeing his name written out in shiny letters by an unknown hand. It was as if Theo could be somebody special, a name to conjure with, not just a useless invalid. He opened the present. Inside, packed in shredded paper, lay a snow globe. He had seen one or two of these before. The glass bowl contained a miniature of Big Ben in the Houses of Parliament, a place he knew from one of his approved picture books. But there was no note with the gift, nothing to suggest who had sent it. He shook the globe, expecting to see a swirl of white snow, a magical winter scene. But instead he stirred up a blizzard of black flakes. Theo watched in surprise as the dark shapes swirled around like bats over the tiny tower. As they settled, they blotted out the quaint scene, burying everything in darkness. How strange, Theo thought. Frowning, he replaced the globe in his coat pocket and climbed into bed. He lay in the dark, wondering about the strange gift, and who could have sent it, until he drifted off to sleep. His birthday had been more intriguing than he had ever expected, but he had no idea that the events of the night ahead would change his miserable life forever.